Well, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Mikiala. I have the privilege of being the Director of Discipleship and Student Ministry here, and I'm pleased to be with you guys this morning as we learn a little bit more about God's Word. I will tell you that growing up as a child and a kid going to school, it wasn't necessarily that I enjoyed school, because I didn't. I didn't like having to go home and do the whole homework thing or write the research papers and the projects. But what I actually found out I enjoyed was the result of doing all of the homework and the papers and all that stuff. I enjoyed learning and having an education after having put in all the work that I didn't really like. And so what I learned was, because of that, once I graduated high school and went to college, I knew that if I were going to go to grad school, I needed to go right away, because I needed to go while I was still in the habit of doing all the work and all the papers and all the reading, so that I could continue on, because if I stopped, I knew I wasn't going to go back. And so I went straight from college to grad school, and then once I graduated, every year it feels like I get into this mood where I'm like researching, and I find a topic that I find really interesting, and I do this deep dive into how interesting this topic is, and then all of a sudden on my computer I've got 13 tabs open about all these different schools that I could go back to learn about this topic, and how they have this online program, and oh, that would be really great because I could do that and still work, and they have this program, and oh, that would be really great because I could go to night classes and I could learn this. And then I start to remember all of the homework and the papers and all of that stuff, and I'm like, I don't really want to do that. And then I remember that there's stuff like tuition, and that I would much rather go out to eat than have to pay for an education all over again. However, I do still love the idea of going back to school. So once a year, I allow myself to go down that rabbit hole of exploring different topics and thinking about the fact that I want to go back to school before I realize I really don't like homework that much. So what I would love for you guys to do today is come with me on one of those deep dives into discovering a little bit more about a topic. And the topic that I want for us to focus on today is this word called trauma. Now, trauma, it has become a buzzword nowadays because it's one of the descriptors that is used when talking about mental health and the ways that we can be healthy people, both physically and emotionally and mentally. Now, the definition of the word trauma is defined by Webster as a physical injury from something other than yourself. So something outside of you comes and injures you physically. That's one instance of trauma. And then another part of the definition is kind of this messed up state of mind due to a mental, emotional, or physical injury. And then the last bit of that definition is basically just an emotional upset, something that just jostles everything and upsets you emotionally. Now, that's a very broad idea of this topic of trauma, and I want us to zero in a little bit. And so there's a definition or a description written by an author who focuses on trauma a lot. It says this: an experience is defined as traumatic when it overwhelms your capacity to cope and adapt psychically and physically. Trauma is any experience that is less than nurturing and alerts your perception of yourself and your place in the world. From this perspective, trauma can be as immediately life-threatening as a car accident, or more subtle, like neglect. So trauma kind of runs the gamut of this idea of things that harm us, or bad things that mess with who we are as a person. And I want for us to keep that definition and those ideas in mind as we delve into this story of Joseph. Now, for the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about the story of Joseph, and we know that at the beginning of his story, he was treated as the favorite child in his household. Now, that treatment by his father gave him that beautiful coat of many colors, and then his brothers were jealous after he had these dreams that they would bow down before him, and they sold him into slavery. And then he was falsely accused of sexual assault. And then he was imprisoned because of it. So Joseph had all of these different things in his life that were traumatic events. These were bad things that happened to him before he was finally able to be this big wig in the land of Egypt. Basically Pharaoh's right-hand man. So I want us to think about that as we discover what happens next in the story of Joseph, because right up in this point of the story, Joseph has now encountered the brothers that sold him into slavery. The land is in famine, and these brothers have gone from their home to Egypt, and they've stood in front of Joseph not knowing who he is, and they are requesting his help because they need food or they're going to starve. Now, Joseph doesn't immediately tell his brothers who he is. What he does is he sends them on a couple of different tests back and forth. They have to go home and bring one brother and then bring the other. And he puts them through these tests before he does this big reveal of telling them who he is. So we're going to read in Genesis 45. And we're going to come into that scene where Joseph is now going to tell his brothers who he is. It says this: Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. So take a moment to imagine all that went into this kind of weeping that Joseph had with his brothers. This was years of wondering why he had to go through all of this just to get to this moment. It was years of his brothers, of years of him wondering if his brothers even cared enough to look for him after they sold him into slavery. It was years of wondering if anybody in his house missed him. It was years of being a stranger in a foreign land, of being a slave, of being falsely accused, and his good name being thrown into the mud. All of that is what went into the weeping that we see Joseph doing in this story. All of that is what went into his cry, and it's no wonder that everyone in the palace could hear him crying. All of that pent up after all these years. In verse 3 it says, "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" So Joseph, who is now a grown man, who is in charge of this major country, the first thing he says to his brothers after seeing them is Dad alive? How is Dad doing? Because at the heart of the matter, Joseph is still this little kid who didn't understand what it meant to be the favorite. He just knew he had a great relationship with his dad. And then to be torn away from his father and have to live all these years apart from him, the moment he gets an opportunity to reconnect, he wants to know, how is my dad? That little boy inside just wants to know, how is Dad doing? Is he still alive? And then it continues on. But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer, and he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives." So Joseph, over time, he had come to grips with his situation, and he knew that all of that pain that he had gone through, that he was able to find purpose in that pain. It continues on. "This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last for 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive, and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of all of Egypt." So Joseph in all of this time, and all of this time wondering why he has to go through these things of waiting and being imprisoned and having to not know what the future is going to hold, he knew that it wasn't God who sold him into slavery. It wasn't God who made these bad things happen to him, but what God did do is he turned his traumatic events and experiences into something that is now redeemable. Those bad things that happened were now going to be something that had purpose, something that brought life to other people. Because God, he doesn't cause our pain, but he does help us redirect it and repurpose it. In verse 9 it says, "Now hurry back to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt. So come down to me immediately. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and everything you own. I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine. Otherwise, you, your household, and all of your animals will starve." So Joseph knew that the position he was now in, the power that he now had, was not something that he could or he should use to lord it over his brothers or people who had treated him poorly. What he knew was that he had something to offer, that he could help other people because of what he went through and because of where he is now. So then in verse 12, then Joseph added, "Look, you can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that I really am Joseph. Go tell my father of my honored position here in Egypt. Describe for him everything you have seen, and then bring my father quickly." See, it's almost as if Joseph could barely believe what was happening himself. He had gone from this young slave boy to the master in Egypt, and now he had this huge opportunity to help his family. So he's saying, "Go tell Dad what's happened since I've been gone." Weeping with joy, he embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin did the same. Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers and wept over them. And after that, they began talking freely with him. See, Joseph had to have those individual moments with his brothers where he showed them that compassion individually, and then he sat in the sadness of what was lost, and then moved on to what could be in their future with each individual brother. It wasn't until those moments that they were able to speak freely amongst each other. It wasn't until they were able to move past those things that they could move forward. So you have to wonder what Joseph's thoughts were this entire time, because when he was sold into slavery, it's possible that he was too young to know how to get back home once he was an adult. So he was too young to know how to get home, but old enough to know that he was taken away from a family, and old enough to know that there was a family out there that he could not be reconnected to. And he had to live with that trauma and that devastation for the entirety of his life up until that moment. So finally he says, "Go and tell my dad what's happened. Go and tell him the good news of what's going on here." Now, the thing is, when bad things happen to us as people, we have an opportunity to respond. We have to recover from what we go through. Now, Joseph and his story and recovery is about him finding the forgiveness for his brothers and then reconciling with them.